When I bought into the cul-de-sac, I thought the HOA would keep the hedges trimmed and the pool clean. I did not imagine it would declare war on my Beagle mix, Pepper. Pepper is 7, slow to get up and more interested in sunbeams than squirrels. He has a voice, sure, but he saves it for the mail truck and the occasional lizard that flaunts itself on the cinder block wall. For the first month, we slid into a routine. Morning walks, midday naps, evening laps around the sidewalk. Then the first letter landed in my mailbox like a summons from Olympus. It was a noise complaint logged at 2:14 a.m., alleging excessive barking. Pepper was asleep at my feet during that hour, snoring like a tiny chainsaw. The HOA cited a clause about continuous noise, threatened fines, and demanded immediate remediation. I blinked at the timestamp, checked my motion-activated camera logs, and found nothing but stillness and a moth flickering around the porch light. The next afternoon, I met my neighbor across the fence, the one with the perpetual visor and an affection for clipboards. She served on the board, and I learned her name was Karen. She mentioned, without asking, that some dogs were not suited for dense communities. She smiled in the way people do when they're delivering a verdict they plan to enforce. I checked the bylaws that night and saw gray areas everywhere. No decibel thresholds, just notions of reasonableness, and words like nuisance that could bend however someone wanted. I bought Pepper a new puzzle feeder, added a white noise machine near the back door, and braced for peace. The second letter arrived 3 days later, clocking Pepper at 6:02 a.m. while I was jogging with him. At that very moment, 2 streets over. The pattern wasn't a coincidence anymore. It was a strategy, and I was about to start documenting everything. I treated the second letter like evidence, not a warning. If there were rules, I needed to measure up to them. Even if the rules were written in fog, I mounted a second camera facing the yard, enabled audio capture, and synced the timestamps to my phone. I bought a handheld decibel meter and logged readings at the property line twice a day. I even mapped Pepper's routines. From the moment the mail truck triggered, his bark to the minute, he settled for an afternoon nap, so I could predict and minimize any outbursts. The next complaint arrived with another early morning timestamp and a threat to escalate fines. That morning, my camera caught something else. A high-pitched whistling, 3 sharp bursts followed by Pepper's startled bark. The meter registered under 60 decibels, and the entire episode lasted 20 seconds. The whistle wasn't coming from my home. It came from the fence line between my yard and Karen's backyard, where the audio spiked just before Pepper reacted. I kept watching. The pattern repeated on random days, always before a complaint. A long metal rattle from somewhere out of frame, a whistle, then a bark. Then came the letter about potential architectural review for my dog door, a suggestion that perhaps this was enabling a nuisance. The stack of paper in my kitchen drawer thickened, each page bolder than the last. When I attended an HOA meeting to ask about objective standards, the board smiled through courtesy and handed me a copy of the same vague clause about unreasonable noise. On my drive home, another email hit my inbox, notifying me of a compliance check scheduled for later that week. By then, the camera on my side gate was live, angled at the latch. I didn't expect it to catch anything. But on the day of the compliance check, it caught everything. The compliance check was listed as exterior only. I assumed it meant a walk-by. Instead, the side gate latch lifted at noon. The camera caught the HOA's third-party manager at the gate, glancing over a shoulder, then easing it open. Pepper, to his credit, froze on the patio with his head tilted. A second later, a baton-like object tapped the iron fence slats near the far corner. Pepper bolted, skidding on the concrete, and clipped his left paw on the edge of the step. The yelp ricocheted through the audio like a siren. The manager backed out quickly, relatched the gate, and disappeared. I arrived home to streaks of blood on the patio and Pepper limping. The vet's office cleaned and wrapped a torn dew claw and noted, elevated heart rate consistent with acute stress. The bill, including sedation and follow-up, chewed up most of my emergency fund. That night I scrolled through the footage on loop, fury sharpening into something useful. The audio from the back camera, right before the entry, captured the familiar whistle from Karen's side of the fence, the same cadence as every complaint. The next letter from the HOA posted a fine for continued nuisance and warned of escalating penalties. I printed every email and timestamp, organized the videos, and found an attorney who understood community associations. A preservation of evidence notice went out to the HOA and the management company. The attorney flagged trespass, negligence, and selective enforcement, and pointed out that the HOA had no objective noise policy. The board replied with boilerplate and insisted their manager had never entered my property. My cameras disagreed. Through it all, Pepper slept with his bandaged paw tucked under his chin. He didn't know he had become Exhibit A. I did, and I planned to use it. The board scheduled a hearing to consider additional fines. My attorney called it a formality, the kind they hope will intimidate you into paying. We came with a binder. I labeled each tab like a lab report: timestamps, decibel logs, management schedules, veterinary records, and still frames showing the side gate opening. The HOA's counsel arrived with a thin folder and a serene expression that suggested this would be easy. It wasn't. We laid out the timeline: the first complaint during a recorded period of silence, the whistle pattern preceding every subsequent incident, the meter readings never breaching common thresholds for residential noise, the management entry captured in high resolution, complete with the make and model of the gate latch visible as it lifted. Then the vet documentation linking Pepper's injury to the incident. The HOA's counsel requested a recess. When they returned, their posture had changed. Suddenly, the manager wasn't authorized to enter my property, and the HOA claimed it had never directed an interior yard check. That argument unraveled when my attorney produced an email chain from a public records request to the town, which happened to include a forwarded message from the HOA manager referencing instructions by a board member to verify nuisance. The email address belonged to Karen. We weren't done. The audio spectrograms from my cameras showed recurring high frequency, interference from the fence line, consistent with a whistle device designed to provoke animals. The overlap with complaint times was too neat to dismiss. The hearing ended without a decision. Days later, their insurance carrier reached out with a mediation date. Pressure had moved off the cul-de-sac and into an office with glass walls and a long table. Meanwhile, neighbors started whispering. It turns out mine wasn't the first dog that had been targeted. The difference was that this time there was video, and I was prepared to press play. Mediation day felt like a strange neighborhood block party. If block parties included legal pads and a stenographer, the HOA's team arrived first, followed by the manager and eventually Karen, whose name tag still identified her as board secretary. The mediator's opening remarks were a blur. What mattered was the evidence. We projected the gate footage, the spectrogram overlays, and the logbook of complaints mapped against decibel readings and camera triggers. The room went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with noise policies. The HOA's counsel pivoted to mitigation. There was talk of updates to the rules, training modules for management, and the importance of community harmony. My attorney collected those promises like items on a receipt and added our own line items: reimbursement of every fine issued or threatened, a formal rescission of violations, full coverage of Pepper's veterinary bills, and payment of my legal fees. We also required adoption of an objective noise policy, with measurable standards and due process timelines. Finally, there was the matter of accountability. The manager had entered my yard. The whistle pattern had originated at the shared fence. The email history tied direction to a board member. I didn't need a spectacle. I wanted closure. The draft settlement proposed that the HOA pay the vet bills and my legal fees, rescind and refund all fines, issue a written apology from the board, censure the involved board member, and prohibit any non-emergency entry onto private property without written consent. A separate stipulation required that the board member personally reimburse me for out-of-pocket costs I incurred to document the harassment, including equipment and training I purchased to reduce a problem manufactured by their actions. The mediator shuttled between rooms. The HOA's attorney knew a courtroom would be worse. The manager's company wanted out, and Karen, suddenly very quiet, signed where she was told. All that remained was the board vote and the checks. The envelope from the HOA arrived with 2 checks and a letter on official letterhead. The first check covered Pepper's veterinary bills down to the last bandage. The second reimbursed my legal fees. The letter rescinded every violation notice and confirmed the adoption of a new, objective noise policy, including decibel thresholds and clear enforcement steps. It also documented the censure of the board member who had directed unauthorized actions. A separate envelope, hand-delivered and unceremonious, included a personal check from Karen that covered my camera equipment, the decibel meter, and the dog training sessions I'd added to appease a rule no one measured. Pepper's paw healed. His bark returned to its usual schedule of mail trucks and lizards. Neighbors started leaving their gates open during yard work without fear of clipboards appearing out of nowhere. The management company rotated in new staff with training that referenced my case without using my name. The HOA newsletter announced policy updates and invited comments, which is how I learned that the new rules require objective evidence before any fines. Evidence cuts both ways, and I was fine with that. An apology from the board arrived, contrite and corporate. A separate note from Karen landed later, shorter and more personal. It acknowledged the harm done and the lines crossed. I didn't frame it. I filed it with the settlement, the same drawer that used to hold violation letters. That drawer was lighter now, filled with closure instead of threats. People love to say HOAs are necessary evils. Maybe. But paper trails, cameras, and a willingness to stand your ground are necessary protections. One noise complaint turned into a legal battle. In the end, the HOA paid my vet bills, and the person who started it owed me money and an apology. Pepper, for his part, slept through the victory.